In 1999, a woman named Fan Man Yi was in her apartment when she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, she was met by 3 men and a teenage girl. Before she could react, they forced their way in and kidnapped her. They brought her to their apartment. But this wasn't just any apartment. The entire place was covered in Hello Kitty merchandise. Plush toys, posters, bed sheets. It looked like a child's room hiding something much darker. For nearly a month, Fan was held captive and subjected to horrifying torture. She was beaten with metal bars and burned with hot candle wax until she couldn't walk. She was starved, humiliated, and completely isolated. Eventually, her body gave out. Fan Man Yi died from the abuse. But even in death, the horror continued. Her body was dismembered, and parts of her remains were stuffed inside a large Hello Kitty doll, left to rot, crawling with insects. Weeks later, the teenage girl, overwhelmed with guilt, went to the police. That confession led to the arrest of all 3 men. They were sentenced to life in prison, not for murder, but for manslaughter, since the exact cause of death couldn't be proven. The case became known as the Hello Kitty murder, and it remains one of the most horrifying crimes in Hong Kong's history.
In May 1879, Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, writes to a Mr. and Mrs. Mayhew, asking to photograph naked their daughters Ruth, who is 13, Ethel, who is 11, and Janet, who is aged just 6. I am going to be showing you his very creepy letters to the girls' parents and also a really questionable comment in the New Yorker in 1995. Welcome to the series where I expose history's paedophiles. Now, I told you he wrote to the parents of the 3 girls. This is not them, by the way. This is Alice Liddell, who Alice in Wonderland is based on. Now, he actually didn't want all 3 girls. Guess which girl he wasn't super interested in photographing? That's right, the eldest one. This is what he says. "Oh, my humble petition is that you will bring the 3 girls and that you will allow me to try some groupings of Ethel and Janet. Brackets, I fear there is no use to name Ruth as well at her age, though I should have no objection, close brackets, without any drapery or suggestion of it." So he does not want to photograph the 13-year-old. He will if she's offered, but he's not super bothered. Side note, I'm obviously not showing any of the naked photos, although this one, even though it's not naked, always makes me feel really uncomfortable. So he goes on to say, "I can make some charming groups of Ethel and Janet in bathing drawers, though I cannot exaggerate how much better they would look without. Also, the bathing drawers would enable me to do a full frontal view of Ethel, which of course could not be done without them. But why should you object to my doing a back view of her without them? Why not? It would be a perfectly presentable picture and far more artistic than with them." This is Alice Liddell again, who is the blueprint for Alice in Wonderland. He goes on to say, "Both Ruth and Ethel seemed quite sure that Janet wouldn't object in the least to be done naked." She's the youngest, remember. "And Ethel, when I asked her if she would object, said in the most simple and natural way that she wouldn't object at all. Why would she? She doesn't know any better." And he says, "If the worst comes to the worst and you won't concede any nudities at all, then I think that you ought to allow all 3 to be done in bathing drawers to make up for my disappointment." He obviously caveats the end of this letter by saying, "By the way, Mrs. Mayhew shouldn't attend and the girls should come by themselves." Mrs. Mayhew writes back, she says that's fine, but she says she's going to come with the girls. And he writes back a really kind of crappy letter where he says, "I should have no pleasure in doing any such pictures, now that I know I am not thought fit for such a privilege on the condition except being under chaperonage." He doesn't want you there, missus. Read the room. Now, if you read the scholarship on this, there's all sorts of commentary about the Victorian age, how they view children's bodies differently, that photographing them nude represents kind of an age of innocence. I don't really buy that. And when we talk about what's going on with Epstein and all of this kind of these like high level people who are being interested in children, I want to show you a very disturbing comment that I found in the New Yorker in an article in 1995. It reads, "Dodgson, who is in his early 30s, may simply have had the bad luck to fall in love with an amazing woman who happened to be 11. Women are not 11. This was written in 1995.
She agreed to go on a date with him, and then he scattered her all over the city. In the spring of 2024, 19-year-old Sade Robinson worked part-time at the Pizza Shuttle in Wisconsin, and she also attended Milwaukee's area technical college. She was a good girl, someone who never got in any kind of trouble, and she was studying to work in the field of criminal justice. On March 31st of 2024, Sade had been texting with a 33-year-old bartender named Maxwell Anderson, who she had met on a dating app. They ended up planning their first date and they were going to meet up at a very popular seafood restaurant in the heart of Milwaukee. Sade shared the plans with her coworkers and they stated that she was bursting with excitement. She was really excited to be going out with this guy. It's April 1st, the day of their first date, and they are at the restaurant. Seems like they're having a great time. They end up leaving and go to a nearby sports bar and they stay there until 9:20 p.m. Once they're done at that sports bar, they end up going to Maxwell's home. Sade's phone revealed that she stayed at Maxwell's home until 12:45 a.m. and then it started tracking her going to a park where her, or at least her phone, stayed until 4:30 a.m. Her phone ended up dying about 15 minutes later, which made the timeline after that kind of iffy. The next day, Sade failed to show up to work and her manager immediately knew that something had to be wrong because she was such a reliable employee and would never do a no-show. That manager tried to call her, text her, but didn't get a response, so they waited until the end of the day, called police, and requested a welfare check. Officers arrived at Sade's apartment and there was no sign of her. Around 5:30 p.m., someone was walking near the water's edge of Watermark Park when they saw a human leg that had been sawed off at the hip. The leg had pedicured nails with bright pink nail polish, and that's when they knew that it had to have belonged to a young woman. Earlier that day, Sade's car was found abandoned on a residential street and it was set on fire. Luckily, the fire had burned itself out, so police were still able to search her car, and in the car they found the clothes that she was last seen wearing and her phone as well. On April 4th, Maxwell was arrested and brought in for questioning, and at first he stated that he didn't know anything that happened after the date, but then they got a warrant for his home and that's when everything changed. Once they went inside of his home, they found blood on the bed sheets and blood on the walls leading to the basement that they described as a sex dungeon. Hidden in the ceiling beams, there was multiple clothing that belonged to a woman and a woman's ID that did not belong to Sade. On April 6th, a foot was found lying near some train tracks not far from where Sade's car was found. And the nails found on this foot would match with the nails found on that leg. Police looked into Maxwell's past and it was revealed that he had been arrested before for domestic abuse. Painted himself as a nice guy with old-fashioned values, but it was all an act. A friend of Maxwell's, who was a police informant, came forward and stated that Maxwell had this plan all along to harm Sade when they first started talking. Unfortunately, that friend never came forward and maybe Sade's life could have been saved. On April 18th, a person was just strolling along the Lake Michigan shoreline when they spotted a human arm, and that human arm belonged to Sade. Although Sade's body has not been found entirely, investigators had enough evidence to charge Maxwell and he was sentenced to life in prison.
This is a photo of John Bonet on the Boulder Police Department website. See the jumper? This is a photo of Jeffrey in 1997, 1 year after John Bonet's body was found. See that he has gray hair? This is an actual Epstein file that you can find on the government website. The number's on the screen. See the jumper? Do you see the blonde hair on the little girl? Do you see that Jeffrey has gray hair? This is a comment I got on Instagram on a post on the same topic. I'll give you a second to read it. This is the very next Epstein file after the Epstein file I just showed you. And the file number for this one is on the screen as well. Who is she? Who is that little girl? Release the damn files.
This is a case that I'll never be able to get over, and it only gets darker and darker the more you look into the people around her. When Susan Powell vanished from her home in West Valley City, Utah in December of 2009, her husband Josh immediately became a suspect. Josh had claimed that in the middle of the night, he decided to take his and Susan's 2 young sons on a camping trip in the freezing cold December weather. According to Josh's story, he woke the boys up after midnight and drove them to the desert to camp for hours before returning home the next day. When they arrived back home, he discovered that his wife Susan was missing. Now obviously it doesn't take a genius to find that story strange, and Josh quickly became the main person of interest. But the case got even more unsettling when attention turned to Josh's father, Stephen Powell. Stephen had an obsessive fixation on Susan. He had been secretly filming her while they lived together, pleasuring himself to her pictures on camera and stealing her things, like her underwear, used razors, and even her used feminine hygiene products. During the investigation into Susan's disappearance, police uncovered thousands of inappropriate photos and videos in Stephen's possession, and Susan wasn't the only one. Other victims that Stephen had been filming were underage girls around his neighborhood. So Stephen was later arrested on CP charges, but it was determined that he had no involvement in Susan's disappearance. Meanwhile, Susan's two sons were placed in foster care, while authorities continued building a case against Josh as the one responsible for making his wife disappear. In February 2012, during what was supposed to be a supervised visit with his children, a social worker dropped them off at Josh's house. But while the children ran inside, excited to see their father, the CPS worker was just seconds away from reaching the door as Josh slammed the door in her face and locked it behind him. He then attacked his own children with a hatchet and then set the house on fire, killing all three of them. Susan Powell has never been found, but investigators believe that Josh murdered her years before the tragedy that ended his life and the lives of his sons, leaving behind one of the most heartbreaking and haunting cases I've ever heard of.
She was locked in a patrol car that was parked on train tracks while a train was coming her way.
And seriously hurt.
In September of 2022, 20-year-old Ureni Rios Gonzalez was pulled over in Colorado for a road rage report. When police received that 911 call, the caller claimed that Ureni was tailgating another vehicle and pointed a gun at that person. Because of that call, officers from two different departments had responded. Once police had located Ureni's truck, they initiated a traffic stop near a set of railroad tracks. Ureni pulled over just past the tracks, and one of the officers parked his SUV right behind her, and he was directly on the tracks. She was removed from her vehicle, handcuffed, and placed into the back of that car, and it was still parked on those train tracks. While Ureni was in back of that car handcuffed, the officers were searching her car for more weapons. While those officers were searching her car, a train was coming straight their way. In dash cam and body cam footage, you can clearly hear a train coming and blasting their horn repeatedly while these officers are still just searching this car. Ureni is in the back of this police car. She hears this train coming and she is trying to scream to get the officers' attention to take her out or move the car, but maybe they don't hear her, maybe they do, they're just not paying attention to her. They're just still searching this car. Once this train is getting pretty close to the officer's car, the officers then realize that they need to get out of this area so that they don't injure themselves. They had plenty of time to move the car or take out Ureni, but they chose not to. The train then slams into the patrol SUV and the SUV goes flying with Ureni still locked inside. This SUV was smushed and somehow Ureni survived, but barely. She suffered a traumatic brain injury, multiple broken bones, internal injuries, and emotional and physical trauma, and her life was changed forever. Those two officers were criminally charged and they both lost their jobs. In 2024, Ureni reached a civil settlement worth $8.4 million.
How can someone kill you at your front door without even being there? It was late November 1995 at a family trailer in Texas. The Blount family were absolutely stuffed. It was Thanksgiving, they'd scoffed their faces, they'd had so much fun, and they were ready for bed. It was this huge family gathering, and even though we don't have Thanksgiving over here in the UK, I feel like I know enough about it from just films and TV. And a bunch of them had gathered at this trailer in the Hilltop Mobile Home Park in Fort Worth. Now, this included Susan the mum, Joe the dad, their daughter Angela, son Robert, cousin Mike, and Uncle Ray. Family had all eaten their food, like I said, between 4 and 5 p.m. And then after that, Ray headed home. And bless her, Susan had had a really long day. It had been very, very stressful, setting everything up, cooking, obviously. So she decided she wanted to lie down at around 9 p.m. And the kids decided at that point that they wanted more food, ice cream, and drinks. So they headed over to a local shop. Joe drove the kids. While they were gone, Susan started floating in and out of sleep, and she was like, I'm sure I just heard a knock at the door, which was weird because it was late and she wasn't expecting anyone. In this kind of sleepy, confused state, she went over to the window to look who was at the door, and there was nobody. So she was like, maybe I just imagined that. Then when the others arrived home with their snacks, they were like, Mum, there's something at the door. And they were pretty excited because this was a random briefcase, and obviously in the kids' minds they're thinking, I hope this is full of money. They took it inside, they were crossing their fingers, hoping it was something exciting. Except when they opened the suitcase, there was a huge explosion. Horrifically, Joe, Angela, and Mike were killed instantly by the blast. Now, Robert survived, but because he was so close to this explosion, when he looked down, his slippers were melted to his feet. Now, thankfully, Susan hadn't actually been as close to the briefcase as the others, and she was okay, apart from obviously being absolutely heartbroken that her family was dead. Other police were baffled. They showed up, the house was in absolute bits. Who the hell would want to kill this, like, seemingly innocent, unsuspecting family? And the way that it was done was so callous and calculated as well. They started questioning everyone, every single person in that trailer park, and although nobody actually came up with anything concrete, the general feeling was that maybe it was the wrong house. But how the hell were they going to prove this? How could they prove who was the intended target? How could they prove a motive? Honestly, it was like they kept coming up with dead ends. Frustratingly, there was no physical evidence the police were actually able to use, and the case went cold. That was until 10 years later, when a prison inmate claimed that his cellmate had confessed to this brutal crime. This guy, Jack Ferris, was behind bars, and he was sharing a prison cell with a guy called Michael Toney from California who was in prison for burglary. And I don't know if you've listened to my latest podcast episode, but I chatted about how unreliable prison informants are. Like, let's be honest, a lot of the time these things are just lies because people want to be released from prison for giving police information. Because Jack ended up dobbing in this Michael guy for this, like, triple murder, Jack was released from prison. But, like, how could they even trust that this was true? Michael's ex-wife was actually questioned about this at the time. They were like, do you have any reason to believe he could have created a briefcase bomb and killed a bunch of people? And she was adamant, no way, this could not have been Michael. And I don't know what happened after this original interview, whether they pressured her or whether something came up. Maybe they paid her off, but she actually totally changed her tune and was like, yep, I even saw him with the briefcase. Now, Michael was put on trial, but he was like, these people are lying about me. He was adamant it wasn't him. He didn't even know the trailer park existed, he said, and he had an alibi for that same night. Despite this, though, he was still found guilty and sentenced to death. But prepare for your blood to boil. Turns out Jack, the prison informant, was actually a pedophile who'd just come up with this off the top of his head because he wanted to get out of prison. He simply wanted his own charges dropping, and he got exactly that. It then came out that the whole trial was actually a shambles. There were 14 key pieces of evidence that were withheld that would have been key to Michael's defense. So thankfully, Michael was then released, but that's not where this story ends. Because tragically, just 1 month after Michael was set free, he finally thought he'd got his life back after these lies. He was killed in a car accident. And as for the triple murder, it chillingly remains unsolved to this day.
I mean, can you imagine being 12 years old and following a dog who is barking his head off, but instead of it just being nothing and harmless like you thought, it leads you to a decomposed human body? Upon looking closer, both of their hands are missing, as well as several of their teeth, and they are nearly decapitated. This case angers me like no other, because the person who did this was right there the entire time. Yet he was only caught after 49 years, and by then it was too late. This is the case of Ruth Marie Terry, otherwise known as the Lady of the Dunes. She went unidentified for decades, and more people need to know her name and story. So let's talk about it. This is Ruth Terry. She was born in 1936 in Tennessee, and pretty much right from the get-go, she really didn't have an amazing life. Her mom died when she was just 23 years old, and not long after, Ruth ended up briefly getting married to a man who was not very nice to her. Because of that, the relationship ended pretty quickly, and Ruth decided to move away. And she didn't know it at the time, but she was actually pregnant with his child. So now, all alone in a different state, away from family and really struggling financially, Ruth had no real way of caring for her little boy when he was born. Ultimately, she decided to let her superintendent adopt him in return for him paying off all her expenses. About 20 years later, she tried reaching out to her now adult son, but sadly, he was really struggling with substance abuse, and he was in a coma from an overdose. Fast forward to February of 1974. Ruth is now 37 years years old, and this is when she randomly meets this guy right here, Guy Moldavan. Guy knew how to put on the charm, but he hid many secrets from Ruth, including murder. Guy claimed to be an antiques dealer in Nevada, and as part of their honeymoon, the newlyweds wanted to travel the US in search of cool antiques. But before taking off, they visited Ruth's family back in Tennessee, and honestly, they didn't really like what they saw. Ruth didn't seem to be herself in front of Guy, and he seemed really controlling and possessive. But it was their first time meeting him, so they tried just brushing it off. Ruth told them their plans of traveling the US, and they specifically remember her mentioning Massachusetts, which is an important detail to remember later. Then, Ruth and Guy took off, but what her family didn't realize is that this would be the very last time that Ruth would ever be seen alive again. In late 1974, Guy returned to Tennessee, and Ruth's family was really excited to see them and hear all about their honeymoon, except Ruth was not there. Guy was completely alone, and he told Ruth's family some pretty shocking news. He said that Ruth had gone missing from their home in California. He stayed for a little while to talk with them, but he didn't really elaborate. He seemed eerily calm and simply said that he just didn't know where she was. This was an immediate red flag to her family, so Ruth's brother James actually traveled to California to try and find her, and he even hired a PI. Unfortunately, though, this PI was of no use. He told James that all of Ruth's personal belongings had been sold, and that she left the state on her own free will after joining a religious cult. No one, and I mean absolutely no one in Ruth's family believed that, but they didn't really have much to go off of. They were trying to come up with their own theories, like maybe she joined a witness protection program or something of that nature, because it was really weird. It was like she just vanished into thin air. Little did they know, though, that a whole other mystery near Provincetown, Massachusetts was unraveling, and Ruth was at the center of it all. So on July 26, 1974, long before anyone knew Ruth was missing, a 12-year-old little girl was following a barking dog into the Race Point Dunes. She didn't know what it was barking at, but she never could have expected what she was about to see. There, just yards away from the road, was a decomposing human body. The body was of an unidentified woman, and she was covered in insects. She was laying face down on a beach blanket, and this was a very gruesome scene. She had been nearly decapitated, possibly from strangulation, and one side of her head was crushed in with a military-type entrenching tool, which is like a folding shovel. Both of her hands and one of her forearms was missing, as well as several teeth. Needless to say, police were quickly called, but because of how badly she was decomposed, they could not figure out her identity. They suspected that she'd been dead for about 2 weeks, though, and they found some really odd things at the scene. For example, there were 2 sets of footprints leading to the body, and some tire tracks were found about 50 yards away. Under her head was a blue bandana and a pair of Wrangler jeans, which is odd. There were absolutely no signs of a struggle, so this led investigators to believe that she either knew her killer or she was asleep during the attack. There was also evidence that she was S8 after death, which is heartbreaking. As for her missing hands and teeth, investigators believe the killer did this to either try and hide the victim's identity or his own. They also suspected that she was killed somewhere else and then moved to this discovery site, because the beach blanket underneath her and the sand nearby were all undisturbed. Since this was in 1974, DNA analysis was not available, so it made finding out who this woman was really hard. She had long red hair that was pulled back into a ponytail, and her toenails were painted pink, which honestly is a detail that really chokes me up. Like, she was just a girl painting her nails, not expecting to die like this. She was around 5'6". She weighed approximately 145 pounds, and she was anywhere between 20 and 49 years old. Without literally anything else to go off of, this woman became known as the Provincetown Jane Doe, or more commonly, Lady of the Dunes. She was buried in October of 1974, and sadly, her case went cold. Even with police utilizing every resource they had, authorities combed through thousands of missing person cases to see if any of them could possibly connect back to this, and they even analyzed every vehicle driven through the area, but they found absolutely no matches. And searching the surrounding dunes provided no clues either. It was a dead end, but they were determined to give her name back. In 1979, the first ever facial reconstruction of the Lady of the Dunes was created, and it was created with clay, which is awesome. This sadly didn't lead to anything, but police decided they wanted to exhume her body for examination. So they did, 3 times to be exact. Once in 1980, once in 2000, and the last time in 2010. They were hoping to get some kind of result results from DNA testing, but again, this led them nowhere. Another dead end. But this did lead to many other facial reconstructions for the Lady of the Dunes, which were pushed all over the media in hopes of someone recognizing her. And over the years, this did generate lots of tips, and so many families came forward of victims who had gone missing who resembled this Jane Doe. They were all hoping this would be a match, but it never was. A huge list of missing women were ruled out, including Rory Kessinger, a criminal who had gone missing in 1973. She escaped from prison and then was never seen again. Police thought that Rory and the Lady of the Dunes looked pretty similar, so they tracked down Rory's mom and compared DNA. But once again, it was not a match. The effort in finding out who this woman was and who killed her was not leading to any sort of results. And after a while of no movement, this case fell cold once again. But interestingly enough, it would gain some renewed interest in 2015. So this is when a theory started going around that the Lady of the Dunes could have possibly been an extra in the 1975 classic Jaws. Jaws was filmed on Martha's Vineyard, which is about 100 miles south of Provincetown, and it filmed around the time that the Jane Doe's body was found. And this theory came from someone really surprising. So we all know who Stephen King is, right? Well, his son, Joe Hill, was reading a book called The Skeleton Crew, How Amateur Sleuths Are Solving America's Coldest Cases, and then he decided to watch the movie Jaws. As he was watching the 4th of July beach scene, he saw a woman/actor in the crowd who was wearing a blue bandana and a pair of Wrangler jeans, just like what was found under the Jane Doe's head. Although the lead investigator did take hold to this theory, they ultimately decided that it was just a far-fetched rumor, and once again, the case would fall cold. Then, one random day in 2022, Lady of the Dunes skeletal remains were sent to Othram, which is a specialized forensic DNA lab. They were able to generate a DNA profile, and then they were able to identify distant relatives. And from that, they were finally able to identify who this Jane Doe was. Do you have any guesses? Ruth Terry. It took 48 years, but Lady of the Dunes was officially identified as Ruth Terry. She was right there all along. Police then found out that right before she died, Ruth married Guy Moldavin, so they immediately wanted to speak with him. But unfortunately, Guy died in 2002 from an undisclosed illness, so they did the next best thing. They did a huge deep dive into Guy's background, and what they found is really disturbing. They found the usual things like what he did for work, previous places he lived, etc. But then they found that he'd been married a few times before Ruth, and they all ended badly. Like in 1958, Guy married a woman named Manzanita Ryan in Idaho. Manzanita had an 18-year-old daughter from a previous marriage at the time named Dolores. And oddly enough, on April 1st, 1960, both Manzanita and Dolores disappeared, like completely vanished without a trace. And police had no idea what happened to them, even though Guy was the prime suspect. Guy ended up fleeing to Seattle, which made him look even more guilty. And although he was arrested and charged with unlawful flight to avoid testimony, he was never charged in their disappearance. But what's crazy is that while this was all happening, police found dismembered human body parts in the septic tank of the house that he shared with Manzanita and her daughter. Authorities believe that they belonged to the missing women, but they were never able to 100% confirm that since back then, forensic testing wasn't available. Even after this gruesome and horrific discovery, Guy was still never charged. And then literally just 3 months later, he got married to another woman named Evelyn in Washington State. In 1961, he ended up stealing $10,000 from her family, and for some reason, he was convicted of this and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Kinda crazy that he was charged for stealing and not murder, but that's just my opinion. I didn't even serve that much time in prison because a judge suspended his sentence in exchange for him paying his in-laws back. After the disappearance of his second wife and stepdaughter and his failed third marriage, Guy got a nose job and completely reinvented himself. He moved all around the US and claimed to be a top-notch magazine writer, and he even worked for the radio station KAZU, where he was the host of a 3-hour weekly call-in show about aging, growing, and making transitions. I wish I could say that was it, but the list goes on. Guy was also the prime suspect in at least 2 other cases: the murder of 28-year-old Henry Baird and the disappearance of 17-year-old Barbara Jo Kelly. On June 17, 1950, Barbara left her job as a waitress and headed out for a date with her boyfriend, Henry. The next morning, Henry's body was found face down on the beach near Table Bluff, and he had been shot in the back of the head. He was naked except for his shoes and socks. Missing from the scene was Barbara and her shoes and socks, and the eerie part is that the rest of her clothes were neatly folded under Henry's on the beach. To this day, Barbara has never been found, although it's believed that whoever killed Henry kidnapped and killed her too, and police state that Guy is the prime suspect. Then Guy went on to marry Ruth in 1974, and we all know what he did to her too. 1 year after Ruth's remains were finally identified, Guy was officially named as her killer. It just sucks that he died long before ever being held responsible, and it's so creepy to think that he lived this long secret life before marrying Ruth, hiding some pretty disturbing things. It's such a shame that he was able to get away with this for so long. I just can't imagine being a little kid and following a barking dog into the sandy dunes, and then seeing this horrifying sight, not knowing that it would spark decades of unraveling mysteries.